name is Christine Farah-Hinsey. I'm the director of the Corinth Center for American Catholic Studies. I also teach in the Theology department, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this lecture, which is part of an ongoing series with the Center on U.S. Catholic cultures. Today we are absolutely delighted to have with us Professor Ospino from Boston College, who is one of the top experts anywhere on Latinx Catholics in the United States. He's done hardcore empirical research, he knows the theology, he reflects on this a lot and has a wisdom about this whole subject that is unique, really, and distinctive, so we're just really honored to have him here. Let me tell you a little bit about him, and then without further ado, we'll ask him to come up and speak with us. Professor Ospino is Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Education at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, where he's also the Director of Graduate Programs in Hispanic Ministry. He served as the Principal Investigator for the National Study of Catholic Parishes with Hispanic Ministry in 2014, and he was co-investigator of the National Survey of Catholic Schools Serving Hispanic Families in 2015. He's currently advancing another study as the National Study on Latino Catholic Vocations. He has authored or edited over 13 books and nearly 100 academic and general essays. Professor Ospino has received for his work several national awards from academic and ministerial organizations in recognition for his work and his writings. Presently, he serves as an officer, and I'm very pleased to get to serve with him as an officer of the Catholic Theological Society of America, and also of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States, ACTUS. Moreover, he is a member of the Board of Directors of the National Catholic Education Association, NCEA, and he served on the leadership team coordinating the 5th National Encuentro of Hispanic Latino Ministry. Anybody who's in CACS 1 knows what the Encuentros are, so well, some others of you do as well, I'm sure. Maybe we'll hear more about that. Without further ado then, thank you for being here. Please welcome with me Professor Ospino.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It is a true honor to be with you tonight, and I am profoundly grateful to you, Dr. Christine Farah-Hinsey, who Director of the Francis and Anne Curran Center for American Catholic Studies here at Fordham University, and her colleagues for the invitation to share some thoughts as part of this series on Catholic cultures in the U.S. Christine and I, as you mentioned, share the privilege of serving on the board of directors of the Catholic Theological Society of America. And I'm also glad to be on this campus, which I have visited several times. Coming to Fordham University is like coming to my second academic home. I am glad to share the friendship and colleagueship of many faculty members in this remarkable institution. My remarks this evening center upon one of the most important realities transforming American Catholicism in recent years, the Hispanic presence. My hope is that at this point in the history of our Catholic identity, I or anyone else do not have to break the news to anyone in the Catholic Church in this country that we are in the midst of an accelerated process of Hispanization. In many parts of the country, to be Catholic is tantamount to being Hispanic, culturally and religiously. In the Archdiocese of New York, for instance, about 46% of all Catholics self-identify as Hispanic, while 43% self-identify as white Euro-American. Demographic trends indicate that the number of white Euro-American Catholics will continue to decline, while that of Hispanics will steadily rise in the following decades. Once again, these trends here in New York are consistent with trends all throughout the United States of America. Ironic as it sounds, I often find myself in contexts, both academic and ministerial, where speaking of Hispanics in the Catholic Church in this country is perceived as breaking news, or a novelty, or in many cases, a surprise. While people in communities at the grassroots level are more aware of the processes of Hispanization transforming U.S. Catholicism, it is usually at the structural and institutional level, including Catholic universities and organizations, where the news sometimes seems not to have arrived. With that hope that Hispanization of U.S. Catholicism is not breaking news or a novelty or a surprise in this context, and after providing a brief historical overview of the Hispanic Catholic presence, I want to focus most of my remarks on what I want to call ethical and ecclesiological demands that emerge upon embracing the fact that U.S. Catholicism during the rest of the 21st century will be largely defined by the contributions and needs of our Hispanic Catholic sisters and brothers. I'm going to divide my presentation in 3 moments. The first moment, I want to reflect on Hispanics in the American Catholic historical continuum. The Hispanic presence in the United States is part of a continuum that exceeds 5 centuries of history. It is somewhat startling that many Roman Catholics in our country still find themselves surprised at learning that Hispanics have been present in our territory for this long. Yes, it is true that the number of Hispanics during the last 70 years has skyrocketed from about 9 million in 1970, when the term Hispanic was used by the census for the first time to group ethnically and culturally related groups, to about 60 million today. Notice that, in a period of about 5 to 6 decades, from 9 to 60 million. And it's also, the number is, has increased compared to the number of Hispanic or people of Hispanic Latino descent in preceding centuries. We cannot disconnect, however, the circumstances that increased the Hispanic presence in recent years from the historical movements and realities that led a significant number of Catholics in large sectors of our geography that were profoundly influenced by the Catholic worldview to form an essential part of the history of Catholicism in this country. Perhaps this should be my first claim tonight. We find ourselves with the urgent need to teach a history of U.S. Catholicism that is complete, particularly one that helps anyone in ministry and academic life to understand the Hispanic roots of the Church in this country. This should happen in universities and seminaries, pastoral institutes, and elementary and secondary Catholic schools. We have an ethical responsibility to teach history of U.S. Catholicism in a way that does not exclude Hispanics or that treats this group as if it were a phenomenon worth paying attention only during the last half a century. Let me make a parenthesis. I'm currently advancing a study on Latino vocations in which I'm looking more closely at the fostering of vocations to the ordained priesthood religious life among Latinos, Latinas. And one of the areas that we are exploring is curriculum in Catholic seminaries and in Catholic theologies. I must say that it's scandalous that in the year 2019, still the majority of seminaries and still the majority of theologians in this country, Catholic, do not teach courses on Hispanic theology, Hispanic Catholic history, and Hispanic ministry. So what kind of ministers and scholars are we training, mindful of the statistics that I will be sharing in a couple of minutes, when Hispanics are almost half of the entire Catholic population in this country? Historically speaking, we could say of Hispanic Catholics living in the United States that they can be grouped in three large group perspectives. Group one is constituted by those Catholics who became part of our nation rather unwillingly, as in the case of Mexican Americans in the 19th century, who were annexed to the U.S. territory via the 1848 Treaties Guadalupe Hidalgo, and Puerto Ricans, who became a colony of the United States of America after the Spanish-American War in 1898. These Hispanics, Latinos, and I use the term interchangeably to avoid a half-an-hour debate, no? These Hispanics, Latinos, and I'm using this term anachronistically, had little or nothing to say about whether they wanted to be part of the United States of America. 19th century Mexican Americans, or Mexicanos as they were known, did not cross the border. The border crossed them. Puerto Ricans were colonized, and even to this day remain a colony. One cannot ignore the fact that the Catholic imagination of these sisters and brothers who are Catholic and that of their descendants has been shaped profoundly by the social, historical, and political dynamics that led them to become American. A second group is the one that is comprised of the millions of Latin American and Caribbean Catholics who, for many reasons, have left their countries as part of one of the largest migration waves transforming not only the Catholic Church in this country, but also significant portions of our geography, particularly the South and the West. Most of these Latin Americans, Latinos, Hispanics, have arrived in the United States during the last 70 years. Exiles and refugees fleeing from civil wars, brutal dictatorships, natural disasters, political corruption and repression, violence fueled by drug wars and gang activity, among other realities, the scourge of poverty, lack of opportunities for the young, and they all coincide in U.S. neighborhoods and churches looking for communities that would welcome them and that would accompany them on their faith journeys. The search for a piece of the American dream that attracted many others in the past to these shores. These people want to share that dream, which they can almost touch next door, in a country that is not oceans, but miles away. A country that they know quite well because of its cultural, political, economic, and even military influence in their nations of origin. As they settle in this new culture, they are part of a slow process of quote-unquote Americanization that most likely will be complete with their children and grandchildren. The third and largest group, and also the youngest, is that of US-born Hispanic Latinos. About 64% of Hispanics were born in the United States. Most are English-speaking, although most retain some form of the Spanish language and use it at various levels. Most of them retain their Hispanic Latino cultural roots. These Hispanics are not immigrants, yet most of them grew up or are growing up in a household where there is at least one immigrant person influencing their lives. Just by a show of hand in this group, how many of you are Latinos, Latinas? How many of you grew up with at least one immigrant person in your homes? Okay, so that's... These people were not annexed or colonized. They are American by birth. They are American also by culture, because this is the best known matrix within which they make meaning about life, faith, and relationships. While American, they are also Hispanic. For the Catholic Church, these three groups of Hispanics, Latinos together are very important. The majority of Hispanics have historically self-identified as Roman Catholic. Still in our day, such is the case. About 57% of all Hispanics, Latinos, self-identify as Roman Catholic. Despite losses associated with defection and secularization, particularly among the young and the US-born, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, CARA, observes that Hispanics as a group have a higher rate of retention in terms of Catholic self-identification compared to other ethnic, racial, and cultural Catholic groups. So it is safe to estimate that at the very least, 40% of all Catholics in this country are Hispanic Latino. But to be honest with you, I think that we are already beyond that. We know that about 34 million Hispanics in this country self-identify as Catholic, which would be about 45% of the 74.3 million Catholics in the United States. Regardless of how we count this population, the key here is to acknowledge that US Catholicism in the 21st century will be largely defined by the Hispanic presence, or redefined, I should say. This becomes more evident when we look at the younger generation and realize that about 60% of US Catholics younger than 18 are Hispanic. Hispanic Catholics, in general, are renewing the US Catholic experience from at least three perspectives. One, people in the pews, especially the youth. Two, rich expressions of Catholic spiritual life mediated through created forms of popular religion and lively liturgical practice. Three, a powerful evangelizing zeal that comes to life through catechetical programs, the contributions of lay ecclesial movements, and a renewed sense of mission inspired by the Latin American and Caribbean experience of millions of immigrants. This third perspective is perhaps the best embodiment of the vision of church that Pope Francis has presented to the world, especially in his apostolic exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, a vision that is often misunderstood and in some quarters resisted as foreign to the American Catholic ethos. A few days ago, I went to a lecture by Professor Rafael Luciani, theologian from Venezuela and one of the advisors to Pope Francis, in which he spent about an hour presenting Pope Francis's vision for evangelization and the renewal of the church and the question of synodality. At the end of the presentation, somebody raised his hand and asked, "Where is this happening?" And the sheer fact that that question was asked shows a complete ignorance of the Latino reality in the United States. It is happening in many ways, but the more we ignore or stay away from the Latino Catholic experience, we are not going to be able to experience this. So how are we going to respond, or how are we responding to our increasingly Hispanic identity as a Catholic community in this country? Challenges that our Hispanic Catholic sisters and brothers face today. To answer the question just formulated, we must begin by saying that the rich and diverse Hispanic experience, culturally and religiously, is a gift for the entire Catholic community in this country, not only for Hispanics, not only for immigrants, but for the entire community in this country. That was exactly the message of the 5th National Encuentro for Hispanic Latino Ministry that took place recently in 2018 after a process of 2 years, coordinated by the Conference of Catholic Bishops. More than 300,000 Catholics, mostly Latinos, in consultation, raised their voices throughout the United States in nearly 2,500 parishes in this country, affirming precisely this, that the Hispanic presence is not a gift only for the Hispanic community, but for the entire church. And much has been said about precisely that gift. In the works of theologians like Virgilio Elizondo, Orlando Espín, Ada María Isasi Díaz, María Pilar Aquino, Natalia Imperatorili, Peter Casarella, Timothy Matovina,